Good morning and welcome to Children's Church. It's time for another adventure as we've been sharing stories in the Bible that involve children. Now this one is kind of different. Well, they're all sort of different, aren't they? But this one involves a child who was not Hebrew, was not an Israelite. As a matter of fact, we never even learn this child's name. Let's hear about the story. Now there was a prophet whose name was Elijah. Elijah heard from God, and God had warned Elijah that he was very unhappy with the evil king of Israel, Ahab, who was doing all sorts of things that God had told him not to do. As a matter of fact, Ahab was so wicked, and his wife Jezebel worshipped Baal, and she was so vile and evil that God told Ahab there would be no rain. There would be a famine, no food in the land, no rain would fall on the ground until God said so. And so Elijah went and told Ahab, God is very angry, and so he said, no more rain. The crops will dry up, the grass will dry up, the animals will die, and so will the people. And Ahab was mad when he heard that, and Jezebel was furious, and she ordered her spies and people to find Elijah and kill him for saying that. Well, it wouldn't matter if she did, because God said what God said. Now, God told Elijah to flee the area, and so he went on to the other side of the Jordan River, left the entire country of Israel, and went off and hid in the desert where God had told him. There was this ravine along this, it was east of the River Jordan, and there was a little brook, a little body of water, like a small creek that was going through there. And God told Elijah to just hide out there, and then he could drink the water from the brook. And God said, I will feed you. And every morning, God had big black birds, ravens, bring some meat and some bread to Elijah. And every night they brought him supper. And this went on for quite some time. Every single day, bread and meat, bread and meat, and he would drink from the brook. Well, a long time passed, and without any rain, that brook was starting to dry up. And pretty soon it was just a little trickle of water, and then one day, that stopped too. And God told Elijah, don't wait, immediately get up and leave this area. I need you to go to a town. I've got a widow, a woman whose husband had died, and I've instructed her to take care of you. So I want you to go to Zarapheth. Now, that may not mean anything to you, but see, Elijah had been out in the desert east of Israel. Zarephath was way up north on the other side of another desert along the Mediterranean Sea. So God was telling Elijah to go from a small brook that had dried up to cross the parched desert landscape and go up by the Mediterranean Sea where it wasn't going to dry up, so there'd be plenty of water. And Elijah did exactly what God told him to do. And he went walking across the land. Now Ahab and Jezebel and her spies had no idea where Elijah was because God was protecting him. And Elijah went up to the town of Zarephath along the Mediterranean Sea, and there he saw a widow who was out picking up sticks. And God pointed her out to Elijah. And so Elijah came up to her and said, can you please get me some water to drink? The Mediterranean Sea, of course, is full of salt water, so you can't drink that. And she said, well, sure, I'll get you some water. And he said, oh, while you're at it, could you please make me a little bit of bread? That would be wonderful. Thank you. And she looked at him and said, look, I am a poor woman. I have no food. As a matter of fact, there's a famine in the land. You may not be aware of that, but I have nothing left. She said, all I have was a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. And what you see me doing right now, gathering these sticks, I'll tell you what I'm doing. I'm making a small fire, and I'm going to cook what little bit of flour and oil I have left for me and for my little boy. And we're going to eat it, and then we're going to die of starvation, because that's all I have left, okay? And Elijah looked at her and said, okay, that's fine, but could you do me a favor? Can you make me some bread first? And she just looked at him like, are you crazy? And then Elijah said, just do what I'm telling you, because here's what God says. As long as I live with you, your flour won't run out, and neither will the oil. What? So she went home, and she did exactly as Elijah said. She built the fire with the sticks that she had gathered, and she took her jar of flour, as her little boy was watching, and poured out some flour and mixed in some oil and some water and made it into some bread dough. And as he watched, she put it in her little oven and started to bake it. And then she took her little jar of flour, which should be empty now, and poured out a little bit more. And poured a little oil in there and mixed it up with some water and kneaded it out and formed it into a little cake for her son to eat. And then she poured out a little more flour and a little more oil and mixed it with some water and made a little cake for herself. And then she looked in the jar of flour and there was more. And she looked in the jar of oil and there was still the same amount of oil in there. And her son looked at her and she looked at the jars and went, "Wow!" And she baked up the bread for the prophet Elijah and for herself and her son. And she brought him some flour and he ate and drank the water she brought him. And she realized that God had provided for her needs by bringing this prophet Elijah from the country of Israel all the way up north to where she was in a totally different country next to a city called Sidon. In her little town of Zarapheth, God was hiding a prophet. And so she made up a special room for him upstairs where he could stay so she and her son could be by themselves and he could be by himself. And there he lived for quite some time because the famine, it went on for more than 3 years. And the whole time that Elijah lived there, God had promised that until the rains came, there would always be flour, there would always be oil. She could trust God. Now, during that time period, though, her boy got sick. He kind of got a cold or something, and it got worse and worse, and he was having some trouble breathing. And one day, he stopped breathing. He had died. And the widow came up to Elijah, and she was just heartbroken, and she said, "Am I such a wicked, sinful woman that God brought you here just to punish me?" And Elijah said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "My son is dead. Why is God judging me?" And he said, "Give me your son." And he took the boy's body upstairs to his room and said, "God, why have you done this? She's provided for my needs. Why did you take her son?" And Elijah stretched himself out across the boy's body and prayed and asked God to bring him back to life. Nothing. And Elijah did it again. He stretched his body out over the boy and prayed and said, "God, please heal this boy." Nothing. And a third time, Elijah did the same thing. He stretched himself out over the boy and said, "God, please bring this boy back to life." And the boy came to life. He did. He was alive. And Elijah was happy, and he sat the boy up, and he called the widow into the room and said, "Look, here's your son." And he was alive. And the woman said, "Now I know that you are a man of God." And she believed. And because she was obedient, while she was originally just going to make one little cake of bread and then starve to death, instead, God provided for her needs and saved her boy, not just from starvation, but also from a sickness that would have killed him. Except because she was obedient, the prophet of God was in her house, and God spared her while all the rest of the land was suffering with a horrible famine because they hadn't been obeying God. And that's the end of our story for this week. Okay, we have quiz questions, so go back and listen to it one more time because there's a lot of details in this story. Okay, I'll wait for you. Go ahead. Okay, here's our quiz questions for this week. Question number 1, what pleased you? What did you like about this story? Question number 2, what displeased you? What did you not like about this story? Question number 3, what does this story tell us about people? What people are like? Question number 4, what does this story tell us about God? What God is like, the nature of God? Question number 5 says, what should I do differently because of this story? Now remember, this one should be answered, I should something. And then question number 6, who should I tell this story to? Okay, I look forward to seeing your answers down in the comments field, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week again for another episode of Children's Church.